Hey everybody, this is Alzorath and welcome to Deck Tech. Today we're going to be taking a look at a situation many casual and new TCG players are put into, and that is the initial deck building and deck deconstruction. In this video, I'll pretty much be covering the way I deconstruct decks that will give you the questions you need to answer whenever you're first building a deck, and I'm going to try and tie it in a little bit to basically that initial kind of building of your deck you get whenever you first buy your starter packs, your boosters and stuff like that, where you don't have a full play set, but you have basically enough cards to build a decent deck. You just need to find out how to weave it all together. It's going to give you a handful of questions that you need to answer, and in future episodes I'll actually be covering more advanced portions of this, as well as the physical process I go through to answer these questions when building a new deck. Now, as far as you guys wondering about the future of this series, this Deck Tech series is replacing the old Friday Night Hex as far as the strategy discussion, whereas Friday Night Hex is moving into the more Hex-focused kind of content, such as tournaments and news and specific combos that are popular, deck analysis and stuff like that. Whereas Deck Tech is going to be basically your general source of good practice for building decks. Now, this episode is going to assume that we're going for direct strategies for winning, because we're assuming that you're new to the TCG and not especially familiar with all the cards involved. Whereas for more advanced strategies such as control or indirect wins, you tend to need a little bit more intricate knowledge to weave a more cohesive kind of combo deck. That said, let's go ahead and look at the core things I basically pick out when deconstructing a deck. And yes, this is actually the order I go in when picking apart a deck for tweaking or for featuring on a deck breakdown. Now, looking at it from this perspective will give us a good set of questions to ask during deck deconstruction itself, as well as in deck construction itself. Now, the kind of 5 bullet points I have listed out in front of me are: 1, you have your win condition. 2, you have consistency. On 3, you have your resources, which are your like curves, fixing, and acceleration kind of functions, which I'll cover a little bit more on what those mean in just a little bit. And 4 and 5 are your weaknesses and the meta. And the meta is probably the most important thing if you're building a competitive deck, but for deck deconstruction, it's going to have to kind of work in a little bit of a semi-vacuum, because whenever you're deconstructing it, a deck that works in environment A won't necessarily work in environment B, because the players play completely different. In an online environment, the meta is huge and it's always shifting, and there's even like sub-metas and all this other stuff. It's really difficult to keep track of or even really counter against. Instead, you generally want to just build a solid deck and then look for answers in the current environment that will be a weakness that it wants to kind of defend against. But anyway, let's go ahead and dive in, just get these in order. The first thing is the win condition, and it may seem quite obvious what it is. It's simply put, if you want to win, you've got to have a win condition. You've got to be able to kill your enemy or defeat them in some form or fashion. And this is generally where you want to start, especially if you have a limited card pool, because frankly, if you don't start here, you're not going to know what to play. Now, the reason why I focus so heavily on this is I have seen way too many decks that focus so much on not losing, instead of figuring out how to make their opponent lose themselves, that they just kind of end up bogging down and end up just losing from attrition, or decks that focus on accelerating the resources so they don't have to worry about like a resource screw, and instead just have nothing to accelerate into. So I'm kind of forced to mention this, forced to look at it, forced to bring up the fact that this is one of the main sources of deck kind of swelling that just really doesn't work out for new players, and I see a lot of them making mistakes in this regard because they get beaten down and they decide, oh, I need more life gain. That's not necessarily true. Now, by looking at the cards and deciding on your win condition first, it helps you narrow down how your deck needs to build. For example, in Magic, this determines the colors you would want in your deck. In Shadow Era, it determines the hero you would want to choose. Now, many people familiar with their given game may say this is putting the buggy before the horse, as they often choose the colors they want to play or the hero they want to play or what have you beforehand, and then build into a win condition just from what's limited into those. But simply put, if you have a limited card pool, you're going to want to stop and look at just your strongest tools so you know what you have available, and then build up from there. Now, the odd thing is, these people who might say that I'm putting the buggy before the horse here by saying you got to choose your win condition and then your colors might end up not realizing that subconsciously they already know what those colors or what that hero does, so they already have an idea of what the possible win conditions are, and they're basically already doing this just subconsciously. So it's not really as backwards as it sounds. Now, even when constructing from a full playset, I actually find doing this win condition first kind of strategy, like consciously going for the win condition first, can be a nice simple strategy for building kind of a quick deck on the fly, and I find it especially well suited for teaching new players how to build decks. So it's kind of there and easy to grasp at. It's not necessarily the low-hanging fruit, but it is the good fruit for people who don't know how to find fruit. But yeah, when building your deck concept, the first question answered should be, how will this deck win? Just straight up, hands down, period. The next topic I kind of mentioned on, though, was consistency, and it's honestly one of the hardest subjects for me to keep from getting lumped into the other categories, because it is so heavily tied into things such as resource modifiers, win conditions, weaknesses, and, well, pretty much everything. Consistency is very heavily dependent on these things, but is essential to a deck being successful competitively, because while some decks may have an insane combo that guarantees a win whenever drawn, if it only gets that combo 1 out of every 10 games, it's not going to take you very far, because you're going to just get squashed those other 9 times. Now, that said, there are a handful of tricks to increasing your consistency. One, and it's the most popular form for new players, and pretty much in all TCGs, and that is making your win condition the swarm. It's basically one of those situations like the Goblin decks in Magic the Gathering, where you basically, it doesn't matter what you draw so much as long as you are swarming your opponents and overwhelming them. This can be adapted in a variety of ways. It can even be adapted into more complex strategies, such as, hate to refer to Magic the Gathering again, but slivers, where they interweave, and how they interweave changes how you play that particular game. But this kind of swarm mentality is far from the only other method. The other ways to improve consistency range from the complex, like, well, slivers would fall into the category of making a lot of things interconnect. You can also do that where you have 3 or 4 big kind of solid win condition kind of cards, and then all the other cards kind of focus into making those more effective or come out earlier. So you have a kind of an interwoven combo thing. And this kind of makes it so if you know your deck extremely well, you can always use it to kind of lead to the same end, and that is victory. Now, this can go all the way even from that complex down to simple small monsters into medium monsters into big stompies, where the effects of the cards are just icing on the cake outside of their just stompiness. You just want creatures on the field, and this has kind of a even curve towards the end. It's not very effective in competitive play, but it works relatively easily for a new player in an environment where kind of mediocre or new players are available. But the simplest, absolutely like straight out simplest way to get consistency comes down to just more of that card. If you need something to function, you should definitely include as many of that card as possible. Even some analogous cards. For example, if you have a cheap card that only kills everything except for blood creatures and hex, you can throw that in there on top of something that can kill any creature. So you have 2 instant kills, but one of them's a little bit more conditional, a little cheaper. Or you can have things such as board wipes that only affect a certain thing or only affect all things. There's a whole lot of ways to include analogous cards, and the topic of analogous cards is a discussion in and of itself whenever you get to more advanced deck building. This kind of thing helps you kind of keep from diluting your deck into other strategies, because you'll have that function there. Now, whenever you're starting out with your kind of newbie set, you're going to have to use a lot of the analogous cards, because you're not going to have 4 of, say, 1 removal spell or 4 of your 1 big beastie. Instead, you're going to have like 3 of one, 1 of another, 2 of another, and they're all just big guys that go for something, or if it's like that. Now, on the other side of this, you have another way to improve your consistency, and that is including less of the things that you don't need. If it's something you only sometimes need, include less of those cards. Instead, put in more of the cards you do need. If it's something that's only a rare trick for your deck, something that you need 1 out of every 4 or 5 games, put it in a sideboard. Include only one maybe or none in the main deck. The reason for that none, basically because it's more often than not you're going to want to include none of those cards that are so rare that you don't use them consistently, is that your deck size, statistically speaking, if you can only have 4 copies of your win card in a deck but have, say, a deck size of 60 cards, you want to keep it as closely as possible to that amount to guarantee that you can draw that card as quickly as possible or as reliably as possible. Otherwise, the bigger you get, the more you're reducing your chances of drawing that big card, that needed card. If something is making your deck bigger than this minimum amount and it's not helping you get to that win condition, it is simply giving you a lose condition. Just straight up, straight out, it's causing you to lose. It is reducing your consistency. Now, that said, most new players to TCGs suffer from deck bloat. That's putting too much fluff in your deck, and there's actually more that can be done besides just boosting up these numbers and making more in there and just cramming it full of your win condition. There are things that make even 60 card decks much more efficient than just this minimal kind of effort into making these things come into play. Now, there are phrases for these, and personally I tend to like to split them up because in Magic the Gathering they're referred to as tutors and cantrips and stuff like that. Personally, I just like to split them up into the categories I call deck thinners and deck diggers. Thinners are basically cards that function as sort of ghosts in the deck. They're not dead cards. They're so much cards that dig around or basically come into play for free or cheap and replace itself with another card. A good example of this would be a land in Magic the Gathering that comes into play, it taps, and it digs for another land. If you're not needing to use that land to play something that turn, it's not a dead drop. If you're not needing that land to give you mana, it actually will give you a thinner deck with minimal cost. Now, there are arguments against deck thinning, such as, hey, that could be a card that works towards a goal. And in many cases, that is actually very, very true. Now, there are other ones that come into play for cheap or nothing that basically replace themselves, like the land, or that summon other things or pull them into your hand on play. There's a few examples of this. They're not as common as some of the like either ghosty cards that would slow your tempo otherwise, so you have to be real careful when they play. But there are examples of creatures that pull for land and basically creatures that pull for other creatures. Now, simply put, cards that in themselves are useless or near useless, but they help you basically draw them, and in worst case, they don't slow your tempo. In the best case, they actually accelerate it. That's what I do for deck thinners. Simply put, you know you're doing it right if on a turn you start with 5 cards in hand, 50 in deck, and 3 resources, and after playing the card you have 5 cards in hand, 49 in deck, and again 3 resources to work with, and probably more resources to work with on the next turn, or another creature to use next turn, that kind of thing. Diggers, on the other hand, are a bit more aggressive towards this end, and generally they are more expensive. Diggers either pull a group of cards through a straightforward draw X cards, such as, let's take an example, Opportunity or Divination from Magic the Gathering is a good example of this. They just dig straight in and say, here's what you get, and that's that. There's others that are actually the source of the tutor nickname that it gets, where they actually look through your deck for a specific card. There's also ones that look for land, there's ones that look for creatures, there's ones that look for spells specifically. There's a lot of things that you can do with this in Magic the Gathering, and I imagine there's going to be a lot of them that you can do in Hex. There's less in other card games that are more simple, simply because it would be overpowered in those kind of situations, whereas in Magic and Hex, it's complex enough that these kind of cards are kind of counterbalanced by the fact that you might actually want a more effective card in that slot. Now, the benefits of digging specifically for things should be kind of obvious, because it allows you to basically pick and choose what you're drawing. Because instead of thinning your deck, this can actually help you reach your win condition much more reliably than thinning. Thinning is kind of seen as, in my opinion, as secondary to basically specific digging. If I could run something that could cheaply and effectively get me my card I need every game, I would so run that more than I would run something that would just reduce the chances of me drawing something that's just fluff. to fill out those 60 cards. Though that said, as to be truly honest, I actually find it really hard to justify throwing in thinners unless it's just like land thinners, simply because, like land seeking thinners. This is simply because whenever I'm drawing these other cards, I think, oh, I could have put a counter spell in there, or I could have put a creature in that slot, I could have put something else. And usually when I'm building a deck, I have to cut down from, say, 80 cards down to 60 rather than building up from, say, 45 cards up to 60, which has happened maybe twice in my entire TCG career that I've actually had to fluff up a deck because my core was just strong enough for that, and that was usually in control decks. So anyway, there are situations to use either diggers or thinners, and many decks incorporate both in some form to aid in their acceleration, though usually they're combined with another effect. Now, there are many other factors to consistency, but when building or deconstructing a deck, the second question I ask after win condition is how reliably will I be able to reach my win condition, and basically this is kind of the big lump for that question. The third question actually comes into regard to the resources, because we've already looked at the how can we win and how reliably will we reach that win. We got to look at how can we pay for that win. Now, resources actually include a few things such as the resource curve, resource fixing, resource acceleration, and this topic actually varies really highly from game to game. This is whenever we start moving into game specific stuff, because in games like Shadow Era, you're going to be looking mostly exclusively at the curve and rarely at acceleration or fixing, because all the resources are the same and there's very little acceleration available, period. Whereas in games like Magic the Gathering and Hex, you're going to be looking at a much wider gamut of resource curves overall, because the resource curves of specific colors, not to mention how much colored resources you need and how early, how you're going to deal with bad resource draws, and how to speed up getting the needed resources into play. All these factors. This is what makes Magic the Gathering and Hex much more complex on the kind of deck management end of things than, say, things like Shadow Era or Pokemon or what have you. Now, for those of you who wonder what all that was about, what the resource curve is, it's basically the curve created whenever you look at the costs of all the cards in a given deck. If a card costs 3 resources, it sits on the 3 spot of a curve. And once you have all your cards in your deck, you can kind of draw a kind of curvy line over it. And whenever this curve looks kind of awkward or hard to play with is whenever you get situations where you see someone say, hey, you have a bad curve in that deck. And honestly, there's a lot of situations where I've had to say that to people. Now, how the curve looks, though, very much depends on the goal of the deck and how you want to play. There's some basic curves that are generally accepted as good practice, but as all things that are considered good practice, there's always exceptions. Now, to give an examples of some curves, for example, a rush deck will have a very high curve in the 1, 2, 3 slots and light in the 4+ slots, because you want to be playing cards as fast and early as possible, and generally the higher cost ones in the curve, and even some of the lower cost ones in decks like that, will be for card draw, so you can actually keep up the steamroll that you're establishing early. Now, whereas big stompy decks may have a small peak around 2 or 3 slots and another small peak around 6 to 8 curve. Simply put, they use the 2 to 3 drops to slow the enemy down, and they want to draw them early and consistently, so they have a good number of them to slow the enemy down until they can get these big guys out later. Simply put, this is basically how they look at their curve advantage. Now, this simple numerical curve doesn't really take into account 2 important factors in the more complex games, and that's colored mana and thresholds, or even resource acceleration. Let's take, for example, if you need 2 green mana or 2 green threshold or whatever you want to call it early on, you'll generally want to lean heavier into green resources. That way you can pull out those mana earlier more reliably. This is true even if you have an equal amount of cards of a second color that rely on 2 resources of their own kind, but those 2 resource needs are, say, in the 6 or 7 slot versus the 2 and 3 slot. This is one reason why a lot of people fail at dual color decks, is they think, oh, I have 20, I don't want to say 20 white and 20 green. Let's say 13 white and 13 green, but they don't take into account the fact that hey, their green stuff's all down at one end, their white stuff is all down at the other. Maybe I should throw in more green so I can get these things out early on when I need them. And you need to guarantee that these resources can come into play. Now, this is basically the basic background behind resource fixing. The tools for this can range simply as, like in the example I used, just including more of the thing you need early so you can more reliably draw it early, all the way to using things such as dual function resources or even ambiguous resources that say provide one resource of any color. Resource fixing comes in a wide variety of forms, and if you remember back to when I was talking about the consistency tools, you might remember a certain land that I said that says search for a basic land, and I mentioned it in deck thinning. Well, it also serves a dual function of being a resource fixer, making it a lot more useful in multicolored decks because it allows you to choose what kind of resource you're bringing to bear on the field, and it gets that resource out of your deck so you can draw more meaty cards rather than resources. So it's definitely something to look at in that regard as well. Now, acceleration, which is the other thing in resources that I mentioned, is in many ways similar. There's a lot of dig cards in a variety of games that cost very few resources to help you pull more resources into play, or that allow existing resources to generate more than normal, or even specific things other than what they already have than normal. Acceleration, though, is generally more important in decks where your win condition is often later in the curve. With a lot of acceleration, you can actually push a curve earlier, meaning that, say, this 5 to 6 end of the curve, maybe even up to 8 cost end of the curve, can actually be achieved much, much earlier in the game, meaning you can kind of squash your 2 to 3 curve and your big 6 or 7 curve together because all the things in the beginning and middle are there to pull these kind of towards the end. This can help fix a really wonky curve, and it's actually a strategy in a lot of things. An example of this would be to say you go for a big stompy guy that costs 8 resources called a Kraken that can efficiently lock down all of your opponent's creatures and get those big nasty hits through. Chances are you'll want to accelerate your resources so you can actually squeeze them out maybe 2 or 3 turns early, and possibly on turn 5, meaning your little turn 2 and 3 drops don't have to hold out and endure for 8 freaking turns to allow this guy to come out. It's kind of a good strategy to look at this if you need a lot of big cost drops. Now, this is not essential in every deck. There are a lot of decks that do just fine with minimal resources, especially in even simpler games. But basically, whenever you get through all of this information, the question you're trying to answer is, how easily will I get the resources for these cards that I'm planning to win with, that I'm planning to reliably get? And that is your third question. That is 3 of 5 questions taken care of. You have your how to win, you have your how reliably win, and you have how will you set up your resources for this taken care of. You have a deck that will function. You have a deck that can enter play and it will actually do its deed most of the time. But this is the point where you kind of have to stop and take a step back and take your first step into the meta side of things. And that is where you have to take a look at the weaknesses in your deck. This is actually the first stage where cards outside the deck come in play. We look around and have to say, what is this deck weak to? For big stompy decks, that's likely removal. For small swarmy decks, that's big stompy guys. And the list can go on. There are counters to every kind of action you can take in a game, unless the function is just flat out broken. The reason for looking for weaknesses is to see if there are ways you can shift your deck to either mitigate or prevent these weaknesses. And usually there are ways you can adjust it. Now, the reason why I do this so late is because, generally speaking, unless you are playing a control deck, your deck's going to function almost always going to be, your deck's function is almost always going to be more important than your opponent's deck ability to kind of counter that function. Now, there are exceptions to this and a lot of intricacies that can be involved, but for the sake of this discussion, I'm going to avoid going deep into the concepts of things such as leveled thought, which play heavily onto how you exploit weaknesses and how you counter weaknesses, because that's an entire episode in and of itself, and this episode is already getting long. I'm looking at the time, and it says well over 23 minutes, so that's yeah, ha, ha, ha. Yeah, I only want these to be about 15 minutes, so I'm already well past that. But the answers here simply often come down to, do I play X towards my goal, or do I play Y to prevent a weakness from being exploited? As a new player, if you're unsure of it, just play towards your goal. That's going to be your best bet, because you're not going to have the intricacies like in your mind with how to deal with some of these counters. But as you move further into the meta and move more advanced, you start to realize how common are the tools to exploit these weaknesses. If the current cards are weak in removal, your big beasties are going to be a lot more stable and have a lot less to worry about. If it's strong in removal, you're going to want something to protect them. Now, this is where you're moving into more advanced strategies as opposed to basic how do I win, how reliably, how smoothly, and what are my weaknesses. You now move into the realm of the meta. The how can they win, how reliably can they do that, how do they fix their resources, what are their weaknesses, what is most popular now, what are people playing, what are the big guys showing off that little people are going to follow. Now, to fully grasp the meta of a given environment, you need to be familiar with the available tools, such as the game sets. You need to be familiar with the player base in the area. If it's a local card shop, this is easier because you maybe have 10, 20 people at most that you have to be familiar with their play styles and preferences. So you can sort of build off against that and kind of dictate the meta of the actual card shop by forcing them to change their decks. Whereas in a huge online arena, with its trends and how you have to watch how the most visible players play, not necessarily the best players, because sometimes the best players in a meta are not the most popular. You have to watch big YouTubers, big streamers, big networks, big blogs, stuff they talk about, and see what they're focusing on, what people are reading, what they're going to do, so you can kind of figure out the overall kind of trend. The unfortunate thing with a huge online arena is that you have people focusing on different little tidbits of this, and they're able to basically grasp onto their own little kind of vein in the meta. Meaning online play gets very, very complex. Tournament level play can get very, very complex in this regard too, because you have all these different seeds from different places. Whereas the people most familiar with tournament scenes are going to have the biggest advantage here. Now, all of this stuff can tie into very, very complex stuff. Like I said, the meta, the leveled thought, and these I probably need to do an episode of themselves because they are just that complex. But for a new player, I definitely would recommend limiting your thoughts on this simply to basically what type of decks are popular in your area. If it's a bunch of creature decks, look at anti-creature. If it's a bunch of burn decks, look at anti-burn, that kind of stuff. And basically running scenarios against them with your deck versus their deck. And chances are, if you've built a stable kind of core deck, it can do all right, even against in a meta that it's not really designed for. This is one reason why I tend to look at my deck deconstructions in a little bit of vacuum until the very last step, because it allows me to analyze just how good the deck is in and of itself. How good it will be if the meta shifts to X, Y, or Z, because you can always come back to these decks later, rebuild them, and have them be much more effective once the meta shifts to something else that it's strong against. Whereas if you're building specifically for the meta, and if I were to analyze it specifically for the current meta, I would dismiss a lot of decks that would otherwise be extremely, extremely interesting later on. Now, all this said, this video has gotten exceptionally long, so I'll go ahead and cut it off here at just right around the 30-minute mark. I will cover the more advanced concepts, like I said, like leveled thought and metagame in more detail in future episodes. As for Friday Night Hex, again, don't worry, it will be returning once the game launches, and we'll focus more precisely on the Hex scene itself, with this series, Deck Tech, taking the reins of strategy discussion for the TCG enjoyment. You can expect pure audio versions of this series and possibly even some Friday Night Hex series to be online in the near future, and Friday Night Hex will actually be covering more like tournaments and interviews and big people in the scene and podcasts and stuff like that. But I'm also thinking about possibly trying, once I get the audio thing set up so you guys can just download the audio of this, to potentially also do transcripts or even full-blown article versions on each of these topics as well, though that is definitely in an air-quoted coming soon kind of feature sense, because I don't know exactly how I want to do that just yet. But anyway, if you guys enjoyed this or found it useful, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and share it with your friends who are just learning how to jump into TCGs, or who possibly need a refresher to tighten up their game. And with that, this has been Alzorath. Keep gaming, have fun, peace out, and goodbye. I will see you guys next time.